Hi, welcome to the Agent Odyssey. My name is Matt Wyman, CEO and co-founder of Vicario. Vicario provides you simulation so you can do voice, headless, or text evaluation of your agents. Today, my guest is Amarinder Sidhu. He's currently a fractional chief product officer at Axonal AI, where he's building domain-specific AI for life sciences and life science workflows. And before that, he was a managing director at Deloitte, where he helped to create Converge Health, which is like a product company inside a massive consulting giant. He's also the author of Becoming a Software Company. Amarinder now runs Innowaring Labs, helping enterprises figure out what it really means to build AI native products, which is a perfect place to begin. So first, let me just say, Amarinder, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Matt. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. I actually don't know a lot about health and health products, so I'm super excited to learn more. But I wonder if we could start with that question about this next generation of building AI native products, and in what way should that change our thinking?
Yeah, so what I refer to as the AI native products is building products on top of foundational models, right? And we're all familiar with these models, right? The GPT series, the Gemini series, Claude. We often refer to them as LLMs, but they're more like LMMs, which is large multimodal models. And so if you put that model as a foundation and put AI at the core, what can you build that wasn't possible before? That mode of thinking is what I call AI native thinking, and building products and building systems with that thinking is what I call AI native products and AI native systems.
Hmm. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? We're getting past the point where you need to build models. This is about knowing how to assemble and consume. But can you, like, how do you think about that first ideation as you're imagining a new product using these various capabilities? Like, how do you such, is there a difference now today when you go to ideate a new product using models versus ideating previously, what I'll call standard SaaS?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot of difference, right? And I think before I get into that question, I see this progression in terms of how we are thinking about building these applications in the current moment, right? When ChatGPT broke onto the scene and it sucked out like all the investment that existed in the enterprise or whoever want to fund a new startup, right? The initial focus was building what I call generative chatbots, right? This is
Yeah.
a chat GPT is an example of it. Perplexity is an example of it, where you just do a bunch of um, general information retrieval, right? You ask a question which are typed in. Guaranteed, these chatbots have become a lot more sophisticated, but they're necessarily what we call chatbots, right? The next iteration of these types of systems was what I call, generative content, right? Like these are systems that can create content for you, and making videos, making documents, text, name what it, and there's a generation of products that came along with it, which we often refer to as co-pilots, assistants. The GitHub Copilot being the most important one. The Claude Code, and we see them pretty much right now almost everywhere, like that co-pilot iteration. And then I think the thing that is still in the works, or something that we have to still figure out, is what I call generative systems. How can you
Mm.
use the generative power of these models and build systems that can be deployed in the ways we do work, automate aspects of that work, and more importantly, reimagine how you could do that work differently than what you did before. So I think that's the key difference in terms of how we imagine systems, the way we have imagined, than from what we imagine in the SaaS world. There's another framework of where the value is, right? So if you track the history of software, and that's something that I studied when I wrote my book. The value of, where value lies keeps shifting up the stack, right? Like we started from
Hmm.
on-prem systems where just implementing the system into the way you do business or way you do work was good enough, right? And then came SaaS, and pretty much every spreadsheet became a company, and we had SaaS companies which were focused on the lines of business. Now, with and then came mobile, right? Like, which was like, how do you distribute those applications, and web, right? How you distribute those applications to the users. But now we're at a point where the value is shifting even higher. We are going into workflows. How can you reimagine a particular workflow and do it well, right? So an example of that would be like a Harvey AI, where they are taking legal workflows and they're building an entire company around legal workflows. The company that I'm currently a fractional CPO for, Axonal AI, that's an example of how you take life sciences, marketing, commercial workflows and think about how we can do them differently with AI. So when you have to imagine applications, when you have to imagine systems or new products, what often needs to be done is what what is possible now that wasn't possible before with the existing things, and it requires a lot of prototyping. Most of the time, your users aren't aware of what's possible. They need to see an example of what's possible that will trigger their thoughts on how they could do their work differently. Um, so you can't just write a spec like you used to do, where you understand a user's problem and say like, this is what we're creating, and then work with engineers. And yes, there was an aspect of iteration over there, but you generally was creating a deterministic system that could be done, based upon spec, but not anymore. So you have to do a lot of out of the possible type of discussions with your users. Start with prototype, get the thought patterns going, do imagine a lot of what is possible now that wasn't possible before. And this is not what there's a version of that we did in the SaaS world, but it's being put on steroids, and it has to be done in ways that we hadn't imagined before. And really that's where the science and the art of building new systems and new products have come to, and something that we're still coming to terms with.
It's by the way, I love that. Every spreadsheet became an application. That resonates really strongly with me. But it also is interesting. We had a period of time where the UI and the browser was this new cool surface to interact with, and of course, mobile, as you said, became another surface to interact with. And we had a moment in time for like a year and a half where everyone was so amazed at being able to have a conversation via text that, to your point, chatbots just like exploded everywhere. We were like a chat explosion. But now we're reaching another stage. And I think this is something you're also alluding to, which is because the models can now take on a certain type of decision making and a certain type of orchestration, it's not sufficient just to write a PRD, a product requirements document, that has lots of math equations for go do this math, now go do this math, now transition this data from point A to point Z. That's not good enough. And it's certainly not good enough to model the true enterprise using these kinds of systems. What the gap that I'm seeing, and it's only been a relatively short time between, when foundational models are really available to everybody, but the gap I'm seeing, you could call it an empathy gap, you could call it a knowledge gap, but very few people actually understand their own businesses, much less a customer's business, well enough to actually articulate a true innovation that can take advantage of these decisions. And so I'm seeing a lot of, and I think this is perfectly fine as a starting point, but I'm hyper aware that it will end. I'm seeing a lot of, I'll call it operational copy paste. Like, take the way the company operates, paste it into an agent. But we will see innovation come beyond that. And I'm curious how because you've done this kind of thinking before, and you've done it at scale through Deloitte and through other environments. I'm curious how you've thought about coaching people through that thinking.
Yeah, I think there's this question that I referred to it slightly laterally in my earlier comments, that what's possible now that wasn't possible before. I think that's the question that makes a tech shift. Once that is answered well, that makes a tech shift kind of spread rapidly, to every parts of the industry. And people have started asking that question with generative AI, more specifically, and AI in general. And but still, there is that, I would say, like the rite of passage where you try to translate everything that you do right now into AI, and then you start, you get the results and you see the results like, well, that's not really very meaningful or valuable. Then how could we do it differently? And I think that question comes naturally. But if you look back at previous shifts, sometimes these things can also take time.
Yeah.
So like the first version of PC, I think, came around 1970s, and then PC being a mode of computing, PC meaning personal computer being a mode of computing, that only took hold around 1985. So like that was a 15-year cycle. And so ChatGPT came out in 2022, and so we're in 2025. So I think if you
But
roughly
we should have
take,
solved in 2026 then.
yeah. So it's still pretty early, but I think everything is happening at much faster pace with this shift, I think, than the previous ones. And I feel like the value question has come um, forth much sooner than the previous shifts. And yes, that's absolutely the right question to ask. Like, what do we do differently here with this that wasn't possible before? And I've done some thinking that I think there are um, a few kind of questions that is worth considering when thinking through or building apps. Going back to the concept of generative system, right? And you mentioned interfaces. I think you can apply the same concept to the interface as
Hmm.
well. Like, what's a generative interface? Um, it is multimodal. Um, you could engage with your computing stack not just through text or typing. It can be voice. It can be whole other modalities that are possible. Like, depending upon use case, you can do it much more with just the interface itself. The second aspect of it is, where is the context and how is the context looking like? Is there a lot of local context around the workflow? Um, an example of that would be, like, for example, in healthcare, scheduling appointments. Um, and that has been a typically hard use case to crack with
Yeah.
software, because, you know, scheduling an appointment is not just booking some empty slot on the calendar. Every appointment has a lot of context attached to it, right? Like, when is the doctor available? Sometimes they hold some slots for right type of cases, which they can open for the right candidate, right? There's a lot of asynchronous back and forth through nurses and the doctor's office, um, and all of that context now can be exchanged through, uh, you know, with generative AI, because that's the interface can be made context aware, right? You can create artifacts together, right? That wasn't possible before. You can also orchestrate the systems. Like, sometimes workflows happens across systems, and previously that integrations took a lot of time, and now, if with MCPs and agents, and you could also orchestrate system complexity in your through natural language itself, right? You can make the preferences more fluid and very, very personal. And the last part, which is the goal-oriented delegation, like, if your tasks are copybook oriented, playbook oriented, then you could do that. So I think there are a lot of things that are possible now with the tech that weren't possible before. So if you take those things, and if you start thinking about, okay, for this particular workflow, how would I do different with AI, and how would I test for it, and how would I measure it, um, and what would I need to see the value? Then I think you can build a process where you can develop innovations. Um,
Bit of a pipeline.
yeah, a bit of a pipeline around it, more organically. Still, it's different. It's not the same as we did before, but that's the type of process that I feel, if you take everything that has happened with the software revolution till now, and what's happening with AI that is specifically differently, that could work for you.
That resonates with me, and I'm seeing one of the variations of that. as the digital employee variation. Like there seems to be a pipeline of various teams, groups, companies that are putting on this thought experiment of, if I had a digital employee, if I had this digital, we'll call it person, that can pick up tasks and do them, then it provides a framing to think about how they might respond, how they might interact, what the surfaces are that they will interact with a person and or the back end systems. And I think it's been a useful thought experiment. It's been a useful hat, uh, and I think a lot of folks are actually making it work. I'm curious, but they typically make it work right now in use cases that are slightly lower risk, that are well constrained. For example, a receptionist, right, picks up the phone, answers specific information, and in particular in conditions where there may otherwise not be a person, right? So yes, it would be ideal at a bakery to have a person picking up the phone to go take the next cake order, but the person who owns the shop is busy making the cake and can't pick up the phone. So that's a low risk situation. It's all upside. It's also, because of the way agents work, it's feasible today. But I wonder about the harder cases, and particularly with your experience in health, how does that frame of like that digital employee intersect in health, and how do you think that starts to come about? Or do you think that's even not the right frame to think about how you would approach,
Yeah, I mean,
bringing these new capabilities in?
I've heard of many frames: employee, intern,
Mm,
whatever you want to call it. Uh, but I think the key part for me is the context, right? You have to program a lot of context into the AI agents and make them understand it. And sometimes for complex workflows, it takes time, right? So
yeah.
if you're patient, you could do it for complex workflows as well. So it could be that folks implementing it for less complexity workflows, that's the rite of passage for learning how to deploy these agents well, and then you piece together smaller workflows into larger workflows and so on and so forth. Um, One other example that I've seen, which is actually a quite useful one, which people tried to implement in health tech even before generative AI came along, was this ambient clinical note taking.
Right.
Which is, if you, all of us are familiar that when you go into doctor's office and you sit with them, often they pull up a computer screen and they're looking at the screen and talking to you and sometimes taking notes and things like that. There's this company called Abridge, um, which focuses now on clinical AI, and they put a device on which is listening to the doctor-patient conversation continuously, and the doctor doesn't have to look at the screen at all. Um, and by the time the interview or the encounter is done, they have the full note ready. They have potential orders, set up. They have some of those things that you typically do once the encounter is done, all done. So I think that's an example of where um, you have relatively taken a more complex workflow and done something that is now possible with AI. Again, it's not the entire thing. You're not, but you are helping the clinicians do their job better. So I think it's the helpful framework that sometimes I feel like when you look at the work or the jobs and you try to take the entire thing and look at how you want to automate the entire thing. But I think that a more helpful frame is that what parts of this workflows, which are like very information intense, and often there's a playbook type of element to it. Like there are certain set of activities that you always do with some context attached to each activity, um, and and if you enable those tasks to be done by AI, the actual human involved in that workflow becomes better at their job. So I think if you take that frame, I feel you end up creating better frames for implementing AI than when you take the entire job and try to automate the whole thing.
I really like that. So, I mean, part of what I'm hearing is instead of what I was calling earlier copy paste, where you try to take an existing person, replace with a digital person, you're really talking about rewiring the organization itself, like just rethinking. And then I love this notion of ambient, right? You're putting in intelligence into environments where it can fill in the crevices and the edges and create glue between the items where a human may not. Really, you couldn't have a person do that, or it'd be very hard to have a person do that, or it's very time consuming and not very useful to have a person afterwards, which means it doesn't get done well. I think this is the other part that we often forget is there are lots of tasks that people do regularly. We just don't do them well because we're not very interested in doing it, and they're not very fun to do, and so we don't do them well. So those are great for agents. But what I'm also then curious about is if now we're talking about augmentation, really, at some degree, how do you think about that human in the loop, you know, back and forth? Because if the agent is off doing all these sort of extra units of work and stitching things together and creating this additional information, there's still some need to understand whether it was on track, it wasn't on track, it's generally right. Maybe there's a little bit of correction here and there to do. And just I will be blunt in my bias. I do consider human in the loop to be a very fine line. On one side of the line or a whole series of test cases where it's really just manual testing, and people are using human in the loop to just replace manual testing in the real world. And on the other side of the line, it's valid, necessary risk management where you need to have a human look at it to understand. So how have you been thinking about that ambient intelligence and the human in the loop component, so it actually is effective?
Yeah, there's a designer um, who I follow, and he recently made a post about how human in the loop is a thought limiting cliche. And I kind
I
of
agree.
agree because I think when you start thinking in the human in the loop terms, you sort of assume that oh, AI is doing a bunch of work, and then we need to have humans somewhere to just look at what the AI is doing and bless it and click on approve or something like that, right? Um, I think that's a very unhelpful way of looking at it. Um, I have a similar frame which I call systems, not agents. Um,
Hmm.
we we are building systems. We are not just creating agents. And when you think in terms of systems, and going back to my earlier point, like how would do these things with AI, as compared to we've done these things before. And if you make the human as your primary user and doing things such that you are making their life easier, you end up creating a process flow that is better than just human in the loop, right? I'll give you another example uh, from the startup that I'm helping, where it's focused on life sciences marketing, right? Um, a typical pharma company, a large one like a Pfizer or a Merck, or they might have um, 16 to 17 different marketing agencies helping them create promotional content uh, before the launch of their drugs, right? Um, and these agencies go and make pitches to these pharma companies when they're trying to win their business, but then they have to go through a lot of research before they can propose like what is the creative pitch around this brand or drug, right? um, this work is done by people called strategists who are creating the marketing strategy. um, the thing it's not that they don't know how to do their job, it's just that they have to go through a lot of research very very quickly in short time frames to respond to the flow of the business that comes their way, right? So instead of saying that AI would do all their work, we're saying how could AI sift through this research for you really, really quickly, find that needle in the haystack in terms of insight, which will help you make that creative pitch better, right? And it's not to just synthesize something that you just trust. It is synthesized with citations. It is synthesized with
Huh.
um, everything that you might need to perform your job from that point onwards, right? So our frame is to help the human over there. And human is not just in the loop. Human is the person who's running that process, right? And I know I'm the words are kind of becomes difficult when human is the person and the AI is not a person, right? And um, so my point being that I think it's almost more helpful to not think about human in the loop and think about the overall workflow that becomes better with AI, and better for whom? Better for actual users who are actually delivering the work. Because end of the day, they are still on the hook for delivering the work anyway. So why just create extra QA work? Just make them more awesome, right?
I love that. But the gap we talked about earlier starts to really raise its head, right? So someone has to have a really deep understanding of that environment so that you can actually build a system that actually
Right.
is helpful, does augment, does actually accelerate, and makes the human more effective and is pleasing to use, right? We don't want these systems that are difficult to use. So now there's a potential gap. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that there is a gap between the team building, the developer team building, and whoever it is or whatever collection of people have the knowledge to actually create this agent. And I think I was about to say traditionally, but I guess I'll go with it.
Yeah.
Traditionally, that's product, but I'm not actually sure it's product right now. We're seeing a lot of subject matter experts that are getting more involved, and I realize this is now speculation entirely, but I'm just curious how you're approaching kind of trying to bring these closer together, because I think it's been easier in the past to have a product person work with an engineering team, and they're just a little closer in role. But now we're talking about people who like deeply understand an organization and a business, and that's a larger gap than most product people have ever had to leap. So now we've got there's more to it now, because what you're trying to do is well, you're pushing boundaries. You're trying to do something much more capable and complex than what we would normally have tried in a pure SaaS environment. So how do you think about that gap?
Yeah, no, I mean, that gap is certainly there. You are absolutely right. I think that's also the reason that we have this new term, which gets talked about quite often now, which is forward deployed engineering,
Hmm.
uh, and which is different from what we used to call delivery. So there was product, and then you deliver your product for your customer. Even in SaaS settings, sometimes you had to do some work to make it work for them exactly for the use case the way they want it. So we used to call it delivery or implementation, but now that's forward deployed engineering. And I think um, there are various flavors of that, but the core assumption over there is that you're not just deploying the product anymore. You are actually doing engineering in regards to the customer workflow where you're deploying that product, right? And what that means is that you have to spend a sufficient amount of time doing the discovery on what that workflow is, where AI has to be deployed in that workflow. How do we measure um, what the good quality outcome would be? What would be the evaluation paradigm for that? Um, and in my mind, there is no way to shortcut it, because that's how we've always built systems, right? So that's why I call systems, not agents. We are just building systems differently now, but we're still building systems. We're not just building agents, right? And thinking of that entire ecosystem, and still thinking about reducing that gap about who knows about the process, and how do we make sure that their voice is the loudest when we are trying to deploy AI within that process. I think that is still the art of building systems, um, as it has always been, and that's why, like, sometimes um, when you hear the headlines and people say that this is not needed anymore, that's not needed anymore, um, you if you all have been in the trenches of building systems, you know that that's not true, right? And you know, having a deep understanding of the process where you're putting software, that's especially in an enterprise setting. I understand in consumer software, there's a lot more thick and rich feedback from how the users are using. But like in an enterprise setting, when you're deploying it, there is no substitute for actually having that initial upfront time spent on discovery and understanding that helps your overall deployment project, all the way through.
It's You touched on some nerves for me because I agree broadly, but there's some parts there that I worry about. I mean, Palantir's idea of a forward deployed engineer where you have to build, I understand why it works for them, and I understand the mental model for why it's so needed now, but there are some distinctions. So, um, I mean, I worked in a startup where we sold in fintech to large organizations that required professional service. So, and we built a system where they could plug in their unique bits. And so for every big engagement, and they were big engagements with large banks, they would build their unit, it would snap in. Okay. But it was always a bit of impedance, more than a bit. It was impedance to the overall organization. And then you move forward into a deeper world of SaaS where everything was cookie cutter. And that was really a big part of the product job, was to try to make the product as cookie cutter as possible so that it could reflect all the possible combinations that everybody needed. Whether right or wrong, what agents have done is given us the possibility of customization at a perceived lower cost and the flexibility to provide that tuning in a more consumable manner, e.g., prompts and language. Okay, but it's still engineering at the end of the day, but it's also requirements gathering. And that was actually what I reacted to when you were talking about it. And I agree. I found that there's a moment where it's not just engineering. And when I was way back in the day, when we had those professional service units, I had a team of people, sometimes myself included, that would actually parachute into the organization to do requirements gathering,
Right.
just to understand how the system worked. Then we'd bring it back and translate it into engineering. And so I almost wonder if it's more like forward deployed requirements as opposed to forward deployed engineering. Because if prompts are the way that it's being siphoned into the system, if language is how it's being consumed, I mean, yes, there are probably engineering elements here and there, and that will entirely depend on the product. But I think a lot of what's coming, and I'm already starting to see it, is someone needs to go parachute into that organization, understand the requirements, and then help articulate it in a manner that essentially write those prompts, articulate in a manner that the system can then consume and reflect. Um, and I'm personally not yet convinced that that's exactly what we currently mean as the forward deployed engineer. I think that the concept is really similar, and I agree on the concept, but I think
Yeah.
there's a new flavor of engineering, or maybe it's not engineering, maybe it's product, maybe it's some other name, I don't know, but it's a new flavor of onboarding, a role that's needed to go bring people in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as it is with all definitions, there are variations of it, and what people do within that definition that is changed. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right. If I have to put categories into that forward deploying engineering, certainly requirements would be 80% of it, right?
Yeah.
Because the nature of engineering is changing, or even if you want to call it configuring these systems and the way you do it, that is also changing. Every now and then there is need for engineering when you have to build tools, etc., for agents and connectors for specific databases, or you might have to create more general purpose agents for certain requirement that you haven't seen. But I agree. I think the bulk of the time is usually spent just understanding the process and understanding where the pain lies, right? Um,
Yeah.
because I think when the thing that I often hear from customers that sometimes is annoying, but also interesting, is that um, when when folks say that, oh, I thought you already have something available in your product where you can just drop it in and it'll be done in a week. And I think there's still a lot of confusion on what's the right way to deploy these systems. And I think there's almost like a under regard for or less people underestimate the amount of um, work required to implement agents in a particular workflow. And it's not just requirements. Sometimes even the requirements aren't obvious.
Yeah,
It's just
absolutely.
it's just having that conversation with people, and more sometimes it's more open ended. Like, okay, what do you do within your current role? Can you explain to me beginning to end, right? And then you have these, and I'm speaking from these conversations that I'm actually actively having with customers right now. And sometimes it's a question like, how do you imagine doing this part here in your entire workflow differently, right? And they're like, oh yeah, that's possible. Like I've done this with ChatGPT and sometimes work. And there's something with ChatGPT that doesn't quite work out, and maybe like you guys can help with this. I think like that kind of conversations where you are doing a lot of open-ended exploration, which in my view is slightly different from even gathering requirements, right?
I agree.
And
100%.
so and, and to me, like that's like in the traditional definition of engineering, where that term was used for problem solving in general, not just like writing code. It fits, but I know like in generally when people refer to engineering, it's just like programming something, right? Like a programmatic aspect of it. But just understanding the code problem, finding places where AI is a good fit for accelerating the process or reducing, the inefficient aspects of, the knowledge work, or increasing productivity. I think that is still an art of building systems. It will stay an art for building systems. And that's why like I'm really gung-ho about that idea of like, please build systems, don't build engines.
Don't build, yeah. I I think also, I mean, the word innovation gets overused and
Yeah,
whatnot, but the key piece is the freedom of thinking. And because I think it's also, you pointed out that it takes time. There's some trial and error. Not only do you have to experiment with the business problem, but you also need to put it through its paces to see what the risks are, because the risks may not be obvious at the first
right.
blush. And I think all this kind of leads us to that, and I think a lot of our conversation leads to the realization that people actually need to engage in some new behaviors. And so I'm just kind of curious from you, when you think about like what skills, what things do people need to do differently so they can actually fully embrace or make use of AI and all this sort of changing technology in the world around us.
I don't know if I can call it a skill, but
Hmm.
just embracing being human more wholeheartedly. I think that'll work.
Tell
And
me more. Like, what do you mean? What is? Yeah,
so,
I like that answer, but like, tell me more about it.
a long time back, I read this book from a computer scientist and philosopher. His name is Julia Pearl,
Hmm.
and the title of the book is Book of Why. And he has this concept which he calls ladder of causation. And he said the first level of that ladder is just understanding association, right? You see things and you associate things with things, right? This is something that AI does well, at least matching patterns in structured knowledge, unstructured knowledge. Um, it can do reasonably well, um, especially when you do it at a large scale of information. Then it can do better than humans, right? So it makes sense to use AI for that level one of ladder of causation. The second rung of that ladder is intervention. You see an
Hmm.
association, and then you have to determine, what do I do differently because of that association. He also calls that rung as the rung of doing. um, so I feel, to things that you have been doing for a long time, delegating that to AI is probably the right way of thinking, right? Like, yes, this is when you see this association, do this, right? That is well
Right.
understood from retrospective data, and you can delegate that to AI. But then there are always some things which are not immediately obvious, and that's what we call edge cases, right? Or sometimes, non-frequent cases, and building an understanding of those cases and constantly refining your goals or objectives for your agents. in terms of what they should do or what they should intervene on. Like it's a process that we human beings have to do. And then there's the third thing in that ladder of causation, which is called counterfactuals. Or
Mm-hmm.
a different way of it is imagining, right? An example of a counterfactual, not in a software sense, is that, let's say you have a headache, right? And you take aspirin or something, or you just take rest, right? And knowing whether your headache went away because you took the tablet or you just rested, like that's that sense, that judgment, that we can, those what if questions we only humans can ask, right? So now
Yeah.
you've implemented AI into a certain process, right? Have you just replicated what you did before into with AI, and perhaps you're not going to see that much value. But if you ask those counterfactuals, what if I do this differently? What if I do it that way? What if I completely eliminate this and actually I ask my people to do something higher value added, right? That type of counterfactual thinking, imagination, is something that we are uniquely good at. And I don't think, I mean, at this point, this is a matter of belief. And I think that there are a lot of people much more accomplished than me who would say that, yeah, AI can imagine as well. I don't agree with it. And yeah, that's a matter of debate. But I think putting
And
our stock,
simulated.
putting our stock in that type of decision making will definitely kind of improve our skills in the AI dominated world. And so I think that's like a longer answer for that, what being human and embracing that wholeheartedly means. And it's my favorite frame. Like I read that book a very long time ago, but it resonated with me now when, all of these conversations you see happening on LinkedIn where, oh, this thing thinks or this thing imagines. No, it doesn't, right? Like there is a lot of simulated stuff here, which is useful in certain contexts, right? And let's apply that in those contexts and don't worry about what's going to lead to, right? Like, if we do that right way, yes, there will be value. So I think thinking on those terms is what I think that we need to double, triple, quadruple down on cultivating in the way we build systems.
I love that. It's also interesting that people confuse creativity with pattern matching from someone else.
Yes.
People confuse intelligence with something well stated. We're having to be more self-aware. And I love the fact you said be more, be a human being, be more human, like that. It also reflects that self-awareness. Like
yes,
we need to engage in that. And it's not good enough just to kind of plow on ahead. We need to actually be thoughtful about these moments.
There's another word that I quite like. It's a mouthful. Anthropomorphizing, right? We have to be careful attributing human-like qualities to AI, right? And I think you see that everywhere. It's hard to use that word, even say that word, but I love the meaning of that word in terms of internalizing it. And as you go about, whether you are thinking about AI in your work or in your personal life or, whatever the case may be, it's worthwhile to think about that and say that, am I just anthropomorphizing here, or there's actually something real here, right? Like ask that question as often as you can to yourself.
Do I need to name my agent?
Yeah. It needs to
Amarinder.
Yeah, it needs to have some name, and moment you give it a name, and then Rufus or whatever. I just learned Amazon named their agent Rufus or whatever, and all of a sudden, like, it seems like there's a person, Rufus is out there helping us to buy stuff, right? And no, Rufus is just, a simulated intelligence.
Amarinder, fantastic conversation today. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely.